Hi there, and welcome to the self-directedlearner.org. I'm Jenny Knight, and my guest today does something a little out of the ordinary. When we think of most people who successfully run a business, we think about people who are running a business for profit. And she is running a business, although she's going to challenge me on that for sure. But Marlene Rodek, welcome and thank you so very much. Marlene, tell us about the organization that you're basically an entrepreneurial volunteer for.
Thanks, Jenny. I work with the Cocoloba chapter of the Florida Native Plant Society, and we are a 501c3 corporation. So we are we do abide by corporate laws and things like that. And what the Florida Native Plant Society mission is to promote the preservation, conservation, and restoration of native plants and native plant communities of Florida. So basically, I was just thinking about this past week. We are undevelopment. So isn't that great? Where there's such a push in Florida to develop because of all the people that are coming into Florida, that are moving to Florida all the time. We are trying to undevelop these areas, or undevelop areas that have been taken over by invasive exotics. And part of that is to encourage people to change their yards or their landscapes, because the more people who change their landscapes, that will give us the continuity of and corridors of pollinator gardens. I sort of think of our organization as having, as you know, that three-pronged stool. We want to make native plants identifiable to people. We want to make them accessible to people, and we want to help them get them in the ground. So that's sort of our focus and our mission and objectives.
So how does a technology wizard from the Midwest quit that job, end up in Florida? And you didn't go back into technology. You didn't go back into business. Instead, you took on, you kind of took on four big things. You basically run a nursery. You've created a demonstration garden. You facilitate many, many, many volunteers. You run a weekly newsletter. And you also are engaged in special projects around data collection of rare plants. So talk to us a little bit about, why did you take on so much?
I ask myself that all the time. And it really does get to be overwhelming sometimes, and I have to dial things back. And that's where I am right now, is dialing things back a little bit. And constant reevaluation. For instance, right now, I believe that we're selling too many plants. Our nursery business has taken off, and we get we develop a lot of plant sales as a result, but that's not really our core mission. And so we need to be pushing those sales off to the other native plant nurseries around town, which of course is counterintuitive to a for-profit business. But our job is to do the heavy lifting for the for-profit native plant nurseries. We need to be spending the massive amount of time bringing the people in and teaching them why native plants are important, and encouraging them to add them to their yard. And then when they want to buy them, we can get them started, but we need to push them out to the native plant nurseries to continue purchasing.
So that would almost suggest that there's some mission creep.
There is some mission creep to an extent, but what we learned several years ago is that we use this Prochaska's model of change, or we use this model of change where it shows areas where we can do outreach and we can get people to that point where they want to go out and buy native plants. But when they were actually going out to buy those native plants, they would get confused or they were too hard to find. And so they would end up with the wrong plants and potentially invasive plants, which is really what we don't want. So what we found is that we have to close that gap. We have to close that potential for a lapse in our model of change, and we have to get native plants in their hands as quickly as possible. So at that point, we started bringing native plants to our outreach events, and we made them available for sale. The issue became when we were doing in-person outreach that there was a lot of stuff that I call schlepping to these events. We had our literature, we had our pop-up banners, we had refreshments, coffee makers, food, drinks, and now all of a sudden we're bringing plants in addition to that. And then any that weren't sold, we had to figure out where to store these perishable items in between events. So it really became quite complicated to schlep these plants to the event. So that's when we started falling into these nursery operations. And that's when we started licensing nurseries to hold our plants between events.
And why did you choose to set up the demonstration garden at Cutting Horse?
That was interesting. Some history in 2010, 2012 timeframe, there was very little environmental outreach in South Lee County. I live in South Lee County, as do you, and there just really wasn't much going on here as far as classes or projects. So when I did my Master Gardener training with Extension Services, afterward, the city of Bonita Springs contacted Tom Becker, who was with Extension Services, and asked if he would help them develop an outreach program in Bonita Springs. And Tom was pretty tapped out, but he asked me along on that meeting, and I agreed to handle the outreach for this part of the county. So Dave Liccardi was our contact in Bonita at that point, and Dave and I started putting together Florida-friendly landscaping classes at City of Bonita Springs in their city hall, right where city council meets in city council chambers. And you know, I'm a kind of a marketing person, so after each class, I would interview the participants, and I would ask what more they would want to learn, and they all wanted to learn about stormwater ponds and about native plants and where they could see them. So I began harping on Dave about the need to see these native plants in the ground and to have for us to have that experience with growing them in this area so that we could effectively teach people about them. And which was really a strong need. And I think that's why Cutting Horse is so successful, is just because finally somebody took that leap and created a native plant area where we could show the benefits of native plants like no other area around.
No, and it's very true. So Marlene, you have many, many gifts, and what has been pointed out is that one of your great gifts is your ability to attract and retain volunteers. And that's what a great business person does. And you've talked to us a little bit because you've drawn volunteers from both within the community, you know, people who maybe have transitioned from full-time jobs to part-time jobs or not working and have more time and want to contribute. But your volunteers are also coming from the university. So can you talk to us about the pros and cons of how you go about attracting and retaining those volunteers?
that's that's probably one of the most interesting things about this quote job. Um, One of the scariest parts of this job is that you have to take a leap of faith.
Mhm.
Um, so you have to take the leap of faith and be willing to commit to these projects personally, because the volunteers don't come beforehand, they come after. So you have to set up these projects, and then you have to hope and pray that that the volunteers show up, and they always do. But it's really a scary thing to do, because in a regular business you would hire, and you can hire, but as a volunteer and as a volunteer coordinator, you have to hope that people want to help you and want to feel passionate about the project and want to work on the project. Totally different ball game.
Let me just push back on that a little bit, Marlene. Is it really a totally different ball game? Only because when I think about great employees, people who are paid to work, and I think about the research out there about why they choose to stay. And well, I'll tell you the number one reason most employees choose to leave is their boss. That's what the research would indicate. You attract and retain people. And what strikes me is that you do something, whether you're paid or not paid, that is the key to that success. And that is that you know each of your volunteers, your employees, your voluntary employees, you know each of them by name, you get to know their personal stories, and you're always prolific in your appreciation. And given that we live in a world where that kind of personal piece doesn't always happen, and together with the fact that they feel very comfortable reaching out to you at any time. And then there's another piece that you do, and that is that you educate them. And I think people are looking for that personal connection, someone who knows their story, cares deeply about them, also wants them to be better informed. So were those conscious things? Like, is that something you learned along the way, or did you bring that from the corporate world, or is it just you?
I don't know. I really don't know. But I do think that part of our organization is to bring people in and and teach them and bring them forward. And I'm at a loss for the word that I want to use, but we want to make this a meaningful experience to everybody who's involved. I like people. I like to get to know people. I like all the differences in people. So that interest in people is something that's important to me. And I'm I'm fortunate. I'm blessed that I don't need the income. Um, so I've been able to not work for a significant amount of time, like 21 years now. Um, so what are you going to do in that time? Sit around? And I don't know. But to me, it gets me outside, which I love doing. I love working with plants. I love seeing nature. I love meeting people. Um, and and developing that.
Mhm.
So, but the other thing about whether it's a corporate job or a volunteer job, when you're working with people, there should be turnover. I mean, it's wonderful if people stay around forever, and there will be those, but there should be a constant um, inflow and outflow of people. And Christopher and I are, quote, highly unpaid intern. We were just talking about that. And one of the things about our internship, Christopher is wonderful and I love him to death. His internship, he's had plenty enough hours with his internship. And he is on our board now, but he continues to stay there as our, quote, highly unpaid intern. But even as I've explained to him, we need to pull students in as interns. We need to train them and set them loose into the community to staff these for-profit native nurseries or environmental organizations or whatever. That's our job. We need to be doing that, and we need to be keeping that flow of students coming through. And I hope he didn't take it as I was pushing him out the door, but truly, you have to have that movement of volunteers. And it was the same in the corporate world. I didn't really want staff when I was in a supervisory position. I didn't want staff to be there for too long. They needed to move on. They needed to grow.
Mm,
And if they
that's-
didn't move on, I moved on. So in the corporate world, not in this world.
yeah. No, that's a very interesting perspective. The importance of continuous growth.
Yes,
And
that's what I was thinking. We need to pull people into the organization and grow them, and
Mm.
then either and perpetuate one way or another. It has to be perpetuated.
No, that's a very good point. Advice to others who would consider taking on significant leadership roles in voluntary positions.
The biggest advice I would say is keep your focus. I mean, the focus is truly on the mission and on the organization. It's not a personal issue. There are people that you'll have to deal with that maybe you wouldn't deal with otherwise, but because of the corporation and the mission, maybe you do need to deal with them. You can minimize it, or as I like to say, I saw this on Facebook, I love it. You can't control who comes into your life, but you can control which window you throw them out. So I'm not suggesting that we throw them out windows, but I think that you get the idea that you don't have to necessarily put them into big roles or something. And sometimes people do need to move on. And that's with any volunteer job. And that's the challenging part. When you have a misfit, I don't want to use, I was going to say misfit, but I don't mean that as the person. I mean somebody who doesn't quite fit into the position, or
Doesn't match the mission.
doesn't match the mission or the position.
Yeah. It's interesting when I think about the corporate world, we'll call it the paid world of business. Oftentimes you've got to constantly be prepared to change, to grow, to meet the changing environment. And what you're suggesting is that in many ways you've almost had to go back to that mission and constantly reevaluate, are you being true to the mission? And because it's just so easy to go outside.
Yes. Yes. Or, sometimes yeah, I'm sort of a black and white person, and there are very distinct lines with me. But not excuse me, not everybody is that way. Some volunteers have more of a what's in it for me attitude. And so that doesn't make them a bad volunteer, but it's something that's just recognizable and something that I have to be aware of.
No, that's so again, it goes back to the managing people, really.
It is, and it's just like any management
Yeah.
type of position. You just sort of, I don't mean to pigeonhole people, but understand people a little bit.
Yeah.
But the FGCU students, that's been a big surprise to me. I always shied away from them because I just felt that they would be more trouble than they're worth. And that's the truth. That truly is the truth. But Cassie is the one who really um, pursued that avenue. And once we started getting those students in, I mean, I think you've worked with some of them, and they are just really a treat to work with. And a lot of them keep coming back and working in the gardens. And, we talk about their love lives or, blah. There's just always something going on. And that's probably the most important part of it is it's always fun. I mean, when people come to the gardens or people come to these events, it should be fun. And
Mm,
that's part of the reason why I try to introduce people so that they get a feel for um, a, a sense of comfort and friendliness. And if
mm,
somebody asks a question, I'll try to get, if I think that one of the customers has an answer, I'll ask that customer to answer that question because they know as much as I do.
mm,
So they should be able to answer. And I think I think you have been there and sort of felt that it's almost like a party atmosphere.
mm.
Um,
You're building a deep sense of community.
yeah. And part of that has been the hidden benefit of the pandemic
Mm,
of keeping the project small and intimate and not really opening it up to the general public. We're starting to see a lot more people that we don't know, but generally we all pretty much know who's
mhm,
coming in or they're friends of friends. And now we're getting people who are just reading about it in the newspaper and stopping over. But now that we're starting um, and outreach the classes tomorrow, then that I'm sure that that's going to change some.
mm. No, that's wonderful. And when you see the joy on people's faces when they, start planting their native plants and they start growing and then they see the return of the insect life and then they, the butterflies and then the birds and people just realize it's a playground of pure joy just to
It
watch
really
that
is.
transformation. So, yeah. But Marlene, a huge thanks to you because you've created, and I understand it's not you alone, but you've had significant influence in creating a very special community. And I love the idea that tries to undevelop those developed lands. Thank you so very much.
Thanks, Jenny. Good to see you.